Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk again to Imam Tom. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on.
Alhamdulillah. Well, as you know, Tom has kindly agreed to discuss the books that have made a significant difference to him intellectually. And today, Tom continues his reflections. This is actually the fourth video on a fascinating book by Professor Talal Asad, this one here, entitled Formations of the Secular Christianity, Islam, and Modernity.
So the first term that he talks about is Almani, right? Almani is kind of the term that most people in the Arab-speaking world use to describe secularism or something that is secularist. He does a wonderful job looking at different dictionaries and classical dictionaries and modern dictionaries of Arabic, and he can only find the first usage of this term popping up in the late 19th century. And what it refers to in those sort of entries is, quote, the transfer to worldly purposes of endowments and properties pertaining to worship and religion. And so Asad raises a red flag right here. He says, think of don't just let your attention be drawn to the fact that this is a very, very new term and a new coinage, right? This is something that was a term that literally had to be invented because it described a new reality that nobody else had experienced before. That's only part of the story. The other part of the story is that the reality that the word was contrived to define was not a reality that existed within Muslim spaces. It was actually an imported experience from Europe, right? So again, the definition was the transfer to worldly purposes of endowments and properties pertaining to worship and religion. So Asad, he points out that in our tradition, in the Sharia law, we have the Waqf, the plural of which is awqaf. And this definition of Almani doesn't make any sense when tried to apply or attempted to apply it to the systems of Waqf and Awqaf in the Sharia law, because very, very often Awqaf were dedicated to worldly purposes in the first place, right? So you see that there's a contradiction here, or an opposition, let's say, that's set up in the definition of the word. We're converting to worldly purposes religious properties, endowments, properties pertaining to worship and religion. And Asad is pointing out that that opposition doesn't exist within Sharia law. That the typical and usual example was that the Waqf was dedicated to worldly purposes, whether it was to pave the roads, whether it was to for hospitals, for schools, for whatever, name it. There's a famous story.
You find that a bit more what we're talking about. So we're talking about a financial endowment here by presumably a wealthy individual,
yes,
to continue in perpetuity for charitable purposes or whatever. Right, and this is something that was attacked or banned or outlawed or abolished by the colonialists, I suppose, in due course. But that's what we're talking about, is it, this kind of endowment?
Yes, the Waqf is a technology, an economic technology, and a devotional technology within the Sharia, where somebody, they dedicate a certain underlying asset to produce the usufruct of which can only be used for a certain purpose. Okay, so if the most common example is to take a piece of real property such as land or a building, and whatever sort of income that's produced off of that land or building, whether it's rent, whether it's crops or anything, then it's going to be applied to a certain cause, whether it's feeding the orphans or running a hospital or paving a road or anything like this. Now, the interesting thing, and we'll talk about this inshallah when we go on to talk about Halak in his books, but the interesting thing is that this is the only type of inalienable, irrevocable property that exists in Sharia. Every other type of property, you know, it has to be kind of dissolved upon death, or it's inherited, or it's given off, or something like this, right? It's changing hands. But when it comes to the Waqf, this is something that is considered to be owned by Allah, okay? And it is irrevocable, right? You can't take back the status of this sort of religious endowment once it has been consecrated as a religious endowment. And as you said, it is perpetual. It's perpetual. It's perpetual. It's going to be applied until eternity. So that's what is responsible. And again, without getting ahead of ourselves, Halak draws more attention to this in his books. When the European colonizers came to the Muslim lands, they were often frustrated because they found that sometimes over half of the actual real estate was occupied and tied up in religious endowments, right? And so they saw that as one of, in addition to the law, which is what Asad is going to talk about, the legal reforms, in addition to the law being an obstacle and trying to reform the law, the other, or perhaps the biggest threat or obstacle to colonization that the Europeans found was the Waqf system. And so you had this extensive, massive practice where land and property was tied up for these sorts of charitable purposes. It was responsible for so much of the decentralization and the independence of the ulama and the scholarly sort of tradition. Again, we'll get to that later. But this is what's going on. So
right.
Europeans had their own experience of sort of the landed religious lands, and we talked about this before in England and in other places where these sorts of properties were they were confiscated by the government and then redistributed, put back on the market. Right.
Henry VIII confiscated a whole bunch of monasteries and church land for that purpose. In fact, the money ended up in his mates' pockets mainly.
Well, there
it
you
didn't
go.
end up in the people's hands particularly. Yeah.
Exactly. And I'm sure he justified it for the public common good and all these sorts of things. So that goes to show you another aspect. But yeah, exactly. So the Europeans came with this sort of experience, okay? And they defined this term in, relation to this type of experience. And then the term gets coined in Arabic to describe a European experience with European oppositions and European sensibilities that doesn't at all match what's really the reality on the ground when it comes to Muslim lands and the systems of Waqf.